Go ahead.
Through your article, The Next War, very thoroughly, but I just have a few questions pertaining to the same. Now, you've mentioned that, that you hope that someone, an insider, would come out and, tell the public, just to prevent another possible attack on Iran. Now, does this by implication mean that you believe that an attack is imminent?
It wasn't. I thought that an imminent attack was possible even before the election. I'm glad that didn't happen, or before January. With Rumsfeld out and Gates in, Gates having encouraged 2 years ago the U.S. to negotiate directly with Iran and to give diplomatic recognition to Iran, I think that's really offers a good possibility that there will be no attack in the next 2 years on Iran. If Rumsfeld were still in, I would say the odds were, that is, in other words, if the Republicans were still controlling Congress, I think that the odds in favor of an attack under Bush would have been very high, by which I mean 80 or 90%. Very hard to stop, actually, very hard to stop. Now I think the odds are significantly lower, and the chance of actually lowering them further is much better, because now a whistleblower who tells the truth about those plans has an audience in Congress. He or she could testify about those plans under oath, tell congressional committees what documents to ask for, which will probably be refused and lead even to an even more acute constitutional crisis, but actually could give the documents herself or himself to Congress, so Congress would have them. That just couldn't happen under the Republicans. And to do that under oath and with a degree of protection from prosecution, considerable degree. So, and moreover, with the information, the Democratic majority could be pressed by its Democratic constituents and a lot of Republicans to act on that information and to block the door to an attack on Iran. For example, I'll be talking about this later, but for example, Congress could pass a bill with, as they say, teeth, with budgetary teeth, meaning no money shall be expended for combat operations in or over Iran, except by declaration of Congress, declaration of war. And essentially that's the way the Vietnam War was eventually ended. So that is, Congress does have that power. Now under the Republicans, you could make the gesture, but there wouldn't be the slightest chance of doing that, of achieving it. Under the Democrats, you ought to be able to achieve it, and if not, they should be fired. The people who vote against that should be fired in the next election. That is to say they should be replaced by Republicans, I would say, given the Republicans' track record, but it does mean they should be opposed in primaries by people who will promise to cut off the funds. Why don't we give her one more question, and then you've got, just give you a chance. Go ahead if you have one more.
Oh, I have a few more, actually.
Many more. Okay, go ahead.
We can do it together. Dr. Ellsberg, the Harper's article makes reference to Seymour Hersh's articles regarding Iran and Phil Giraldi's information. With the benefit of your own personal hindsight, which you've written about, knowing what you knew in 1964 and still requiring great courage, but coming forward 7 years later, what would you say to encourage people inside the administration now that know what's going on to try to head off an attack on Iran?
I would say that the possibility of actually affecting events is incomparably greater before a war has started than once it's started. For that reason, I do think that whistleblowing on Iraq is still worthwhile, but I can hardly think of a revelation by itself that would get us out of Iraq. The momentum there and the inertia is so great, even with a Democratic Congress and even with a Democratic president, if we get one in 2008, that the odds are against our getting out of Iraq, in my opinion. I'm thinking back to the Vietnam experience on that. But before the war has started, I believe that there's great chance to prevent the president from preparing and carrying out in secret a crazy plan. and attacking Iran would be crazy. One of the trio of crazy advocates of this, Rumsfeld, has now left. And so the chance has gone somewhat down, but we still have Bush and Cheney, who are, as far as we know, still committed to that plan. The chance of stopping them, even from within their own administration, with Gates and with Baker's influence and perhaps with his father's influence, Bush's earthly father, as he called him once, who is a better advisor, I would say, than any other voices that have counseled Bush, that there is a chance really of stopping it. So I would say that even though, say under a Republican Congress, they would be facing the likelihood of prosecution, that it would be well worthwhile to avert a war. Actually, the chance of prosecution and of conviction is much less now. They have Democratic committees to testify to. So in that position, I would say the risks are less and the promise of achieving something is much more. So I hope that people will risk their careers in a way that really none has done so far.
Let's just say in that climate, in the current climate, referring back to your own experience, you had reportedly shopped the Pentagon Papers to senators, hoping that someone with immunity
yes.
would leak it and you wouldn't expose yourself to, possible criminal sanctions.
By the way, I assumed at the time that I still would have a high, in fact, I was told by a lawyer that I would have a good risk of prosecution, even if the Senate brought it out, as he put it, 50% instead of 90%. But 50 is better than 90, and I liked that. My main thought was that the Congress could do a better job than the papers, that I had the wrong belief, I think, that Congress was less likely to pick up an issue from the papers. That was mistaken. I didn't know the press. But that they would think, well, we don't want to dance to the tune of the newspapers. Well, that's one of the few tunes they do dance to, other than campaign contributors and voters, campaign contributors at the top of the list. But the New York Times, say, is an agenda setter to a large extent. And Neil Sheehan was right. I should have given it to the Times right away. As it was, I did give it to Senator Fulbright, and I gave it to a couple of other senators. I gave material to Senator McGovern and to Senator Mathias and to Representative Pete McCloskey. And actually, each of them said they would use it at first. They've said somewhat the opposite later. But in fact, they said they would use it. And each of them then backed away when they saw the political risks. They didn't face any legal risks as under the Constitution, but they could have been punished in a variety of ways by the administration administratively. And they didn't want to do that. So I wasted 22 months in that way. And I would tell people now, do go to Congress, but the press at the same time. And I repeat, going to congressional committees now under the Democrats has a much higher promise.
Well, I'm puzzled a little at that because the time frame we're talking about is 18, 20 months prior to George McGovern's presidential campaign, standing on an anti-war position, and yet he was reluctant at the time to take the political risk of introducing this.
Well, you see, he precisely, by the way, I sympathized with him about this particular decision. I didn't really criticize him for it. Running for president, the keeper of the secrets, in effect, he would have been subject to very great charge by the Republicans in particular, had it been said, this man can't be trusted to keep secrets, and so forth. So actually, when I talked to him, I said to him right away, you're running for president, and are you sure really you can afford to do this? And his first reaction was he could. He said, my funders are different from the other candidates, and they won't mind this. He thought he could run on it. But it was this, a week later, that Gaylord Nelson, his friend, who was very anti-war, as much as anybody in the Congress, but persuaded him, you're running for president, you can't afford to do something this radical. And of course, no senator has ever done it.
So now, at the time...
Except, wait, I should take that back. Senator Senator Gravel did do it. He tried to read the Pentagon Papers into the congressional record a year later. And he paid politically significantly for it. He was regarded as an extremist, basically.
The climate now I know subsequent to that time, there was, various sunshine laws and, whistleblower statutes and things that are ostensibly protections for people who do whistleblower.
Not in the national security field. Very, very little. When it comes to classified material, they've never really legislated any protections.
And the climate now, of course, is that, many people, well, the climate is much more oppressive now than perhaps.
Very much so. I would hope Congress could change on that. There's certainly, without any question in my mind, should be a clear-cut ability for people to give information, classified information, to members of Congress, certainly to the committees. But recently this year, when Russell Tice from National Security Agency offered himself publicly to give information on what he said were illegal programs by NSA other than the NSA taps that we knew about, he was told by NSA, and Congress was told, they didn't have the clearances to hear him. Now that's an astonishing statement. The Intelligence Committee thought they had every right to see every bit of information in the Intelligence Committee. The administration said no, and no one was willing to take them on, really, on a constitutional issue like that. Obviously, you can't have oversight if they're going to claim a clearance problem that you can't even tell the Intelligence Committee. So that ought to change.
Who do you expect will be the head of the Senate Intelligence Committee?
Well, the Senate, probably, I don't really know. Jay Rockefeller is the ranking minority member up till now. It might be him. I haven't heard anything against that. We know that Nancy Pelosi is trying to move Jane Harman from the House Intelligence Committee chairmanship. Jane Harman has been very deferential to the military in general. She comes from a very military subsidized district. And Nancy Pelosi has wanted her out of there for some time, and I hope that will happen.
And again, the climate that existed before with McGovern, for example, do you think it's possible that same fear of not being, the Democrats are now back in power?
They'll be just as timid as before. See, one thing that they all suffer from is they can't be prosecuted for anything they say on the floor of the Senate or the House under the Constitution. Their offices are no longer sacrosanct, as we've just seen from this, one guy they raided. But and that could have happened in my case. But on the floor, they can't be questioned. However, they can be cut off from classified information on the grounds that we can't trust you with it. And that would mean they couldn't get on crucial committees. They would lose face in Congress and with their constituents. So the mere threat of cutting them off from this being lied to in secret, which is losing their clearance, means they don't get disinformation that's top secret anymore, as happened in 2002. They were lied into the war. And they want to be able to do that, to be able to say, we made this rotten decision because we were lied to. But if you're just forced back on your common sense in the newspapers, then you'd be responsible for terrible decisions.
Allie?
Yeah, question.
Yeah.
Well, I just go back to your article where you mentioned that unless attacked itself, Iran poses no threat to the United States. Now, I just wanted to know what your views are about the Iranian President Ahmadinejad and his policies.
Oh, yeah.
Do you believe that he is a madman, like Time Magazine just very recently described him?
Well, first, I don't know. I try to read about this and to make myself informed. Obviously, I'm no expert on that area, nor, of course, are most of the people commenting, but I try to form my own judgment. The best opinions I've heard are that Ahmadinejad is not correctly described as a madman in any clinical sense, that he's a populist, something of a demagogue, and certainly a believer in Islamic fundamentalism. So believes in theocracy, essentially. Now the second point, so he's not a Democrat at heart. The second point, though, that people who do know the situation say unanimously is that he has very little power, that what he thinks about their nuclear energy program, for example, has very little more to do with that program than the man or woman in the street. The supreme authority, the Ayatollahs, totally control that, and through their Revolutionary Guard, totally control the nuclear energy program or weapons program if it comes to that. And so his opinion is not crucial there. And the Ayatollah, they're actually, for what it's worth, far from talking the way Ahmadinejad does, has issued a fatwa, an edict, that nuclear weapons are un-Islamic, which is plausible, by the way. They should be seen, I would say, as un-Christian, un-Jewish, un-Hindu, but of course they're not, since all these other countries, these other religious bases, have nuclear weapons. But they certainly are, it's plausible, without knowing much about Islam, that this authority will say they're against. They're weapons of mass murder. We don't want them and we don't need them. That isn't to say that one could rely on that not changing totally. Still, that is the word from the person who is in charge, and it's better than his saying we do have to have them, or that we have a right to them, which he could make a case for too, but in political terms. But rather than say that, he said the opposite. I think, by the way, there's every reason to believe that Iran, both these authorities, are pursuing a nuclear energy program at this point, which will give them a capability for nuclear weapons fairly fast, should they want that in 5 or 10 years. In other words, a dual capability. There's no reason, the IAEA has said that there's no scrap of evidence that would point to a decision or a determination to have nuclear weapons. Everything they're doing is totally consistent with a nuclear energy program, as they've said. It's not as though they've been caught with designing nuclear weapons or preparing vehicles that are only for nuclear weapons and so forth. There's a lot of countries that have given themselves the capability to have nuclear weapons very fast. You can't do that overnight. Japan could be a nuclear superpower within a year or two and could have nuclear weapons within a day or two. That's how close they are. And other countries like Brazil and Argentina and many others have the kind of capability that Iran seems to be trying to get. So, in other words, as things are going, I think they could end up 5 or 10 years from now, more likely 10 according to CIA, with nuclear weapons, and that would be bad for the world. It wouldn't be good. On the other hand, the chance to keep them from exploiting that capability and actually building the weapons, keep them from doing what Israel, India, and Pakistan did do, that is, get up to the point and then build them, is really pretty good. They're making negotiating points. People who know it seem to have a good chance of heading that off, as North Korean weapons could almost surely have been headed off by agreement and diplomacy of the kind Clinton was pursuing. And it's Bush's fault almost entirely that he reversed that course, apparently because it was Clinton's, and because he was paying attention only to attacking the Middle East, attacking Iraq. It was totally irresponsible to follow a policy that led to North Korean weapons.
We've been very fortunate to have Dr. Ellsberg this time. We're going to wait until the rest of
Okay, yeah. Donna, you finished? Or did you have
It's
one more?
personal question
Sure.
of interest. Ellsberg paradox.
Well, that's not a very news program tomorrow.
Is there a 10th century for my own?
You know, the easiest thing would be to refer you to Google, type in, not under news, or even under news actually, Google Ellsberg paradox, and surprisingly enough, after 35 years, when I first published that, you'll find it even under Google News. There's generally, but certainly under Google, there's been 400 or 500 articles based on it since. So that'll explain better than I could in a minute.
Thank you, Dr.
Yeah.